All right, folks, welcome back to Getting In a College Coach Conversation. We just had a great discussion around gap years and how students can engage with a gap year after they've decided where they're going to enroll and can pursue an international or other opportunity before they enroll in college for their first year. Now, we're going to talk next a little bit about students who are interested in athletic recruitment and are likely athletes, hopefully athletes at this point in time as well, and how that fits in with the whole college application process. So joining me to talk about this particular segment is going to be my colleague, Kenan Dick, from the other side of the country. Hey, Kenan, how's it going?
Good. We're doing well here.
Good. So Kenan, you're wearing a Rutgers shirt today. Is that something, is that like just for the fans or?
Just for the fans, I thought it was apropos for this discussion since my oldest son played golf for Rutgers. So I thought, why not if we're on camera?
I love it. No, I love it. So you've got a student athlete in the house or once had a student athlete in the household.
Right.
And now we're in a position where we're talking a little bit about athletics. Now, the big question that I want to ask you, and this is something that comes up quite often when I'm talking with families where a student is interested in college sports. How do I know if I'm good enough? Like, I want to just start with that from the get-go. How do you know if you're good enough to play D1, D2, D3 level college sports?
That's a really good question. And we do get that quite often. I think there's a couple of ways to approach this in terms of this conversation. I think having an honest conversation with coaches, whether that's from your travel team or your varsity coach, et cetera, at your high school, about what their assessment is, can be one approach to this. Depending upon their experience with college athletics, they may be able to give you a pretty fair assessment of what the likelihood of recruitment would be, or the ability to walk on to D1, 2, or 3 programs. So that would be one potential option. Another potential option is many of the colleges will have ID camps that they take or they hold over the summers. And many times there's an evaluation that goes with that, so that students can go do the skills practice, play for those camps, and get an assessment at the end of whether or not they're going to be kind of anywhere in that pecking order for Division 1, 2, and 3. And so I think that is primarily for most students, how they can get that assessment. Quite honestly, for students who are strong D1 material, they probably already know, right? And many times, even as a freshman, they've been contacted. They've already had coach interest from a variety of different sources. So they're already on a lot of people's radars. And that's often how the D1 students will kind of get that alert, if you will.
And that has to do with the fact that athletes of this caliber are typically playing on travel teams, are already running in these kind of circles, competing against other people who are of that caliber. Is that typically the reason that they're confident, or is it just having a skill level in whatever context that they're playing where they are beating everyone else around them, for lack of a better term?
Yeah, I think it's a little bit of both. And I think that it depends upon the type of sport. If it's a field sport where it's kind of talent-based and not time-based, like swimming or track, then oftentimes they are the superstars, right? I mean, even as a freshman and sophomore, they're often the lead scorer for the soccer team. And they just are a standout athlete among their high school, certainly their division, et cetera. And there are some programs, like the Haverford School or Hill Academy, those types of places where, a good number of students are going to be Division I athletes from that program, right? They're just huge powerhouse programs at the high school level. And so that's going to be a little bit different. But for the most part, most students are going to be a standout superstar, in the context of normal varsity sports and division sports.
Gotcha. I'm thinking about, I played high school baseball, and I'm thinking about one guy who was a year older than me, who ended up in the major leagues and played in the College World Series. And, it was exceptional, but he was exceptional. Like, it was very clear that he was the best player. And we occasionally played against people where scouts would show up to watch someone pitch and bring radar guns, and you would see them in the stands. and they weren't showing up for my games with those radar guns. They knew, that I wasn't going to be anywhere on their radar screen. So you definitely get that vibe. And I think that as a player, you just want to have an honest conversation about what your skill level is and whether that means you're going to be actively recruited. So let's talk a little bit about timeline and how it fits for students of different ages. Now, I think that where things are the most salient is going to be with the junior, but let's put them on ice for a moment and think a little bit about freshmen and sophomores. What are some things that I should be doing if I'm a 9th or a 10th grader? I'm in the position where I could be recruited for college sports. How should I be engaging with that process in the first half of high school?
I think there's a big difference between students that are thinking about Division III or NAIA versus Division I and II.
Okay.
The rules are going to be different for Division III programs. Primarily, they have all sorts of options, or the coaches have full ability to contact students almost at any time, even as a 9th grader or a 10th grader. Okay. And so if you're thinking about Division III, then, if there are tournaments, showcases, et cetera, or events where there are going to be coaches, then you might want to strike up a conversation with some of those D3 coaches to see what their thoughts were. But for the most part, for Division I athletes, it's going to be the gap between the sophomore and junior year. Once June 15th hits, that's when the floodgates open. Yeah. And the coaches have the ability to proactively reach out and contact the student. And that's when you'll get a lot of recruiting information, especially if you're attending those types of showcases and have been noticed at that level. So I think it depends upon if you're D3 or D1 or 2. But usually going into your junior year, you're pretty well aware of where you're going to kind of fit in that order and what division is most likely going to be your landing zone.
Now, and the distinction between the rules around coaches contacting, that has to do with the relationship between scholarship dollars and the divisions, correct? Like Division III, there's no athletic scholarships that are available for any D3 schools. But for D1 Correct. And D2 programs, they do have athletic scholarships available for students. And so the rules are because there's money attached to this recruitment process, more or less.
To some extent. I think the outlier is going to be Division II, where it's kind of like halfway between Division III and Division I, even though they do have scholarships available for students. So their timeline is actually closer to a D3. They do have more restrictions in terms of unofficial visits and official visits, things of that nature. But in terms of contact, they can do it earlier on than Division I programs can. Gotcha. So they're a little bit of a hybrid in between. And it also depends upon what the sport is. Okay. So for most sports, they have June 15th is again, when I said the floodgates open, but there are unique timelines for football, baseball, basketball, as well as lacrosse, softball, and ice hockey. So those sports have a kind of a unique set of windows that you'll have to look at their specific timelines to understand that recruitment process. But those are the outliers as well, even for Division I.
But for most students, there's going to be a point around June 15th, a couple of months from now, if I'm a 10th grader moving into 11th grade, where I'm going to have a pretty clear sense of whether I'm a serious college athlete or I'm under consideration for recruitment at D1 schools. And if I've been under consideration from D3 programs, coaches might have been in touch with me. There might have been some conversation that's been happening already, but more likely, I would imagine D3 coaches are focused on older high school students as they're thinking about rounding out their rosters and putting those teams together. Does that sound right instinctively?
It does for the most part. I think there are some exceptions to that. I know that so there are some strong D3 field hockey programs that are a good example of that, where they're done recruiting in the 10th grade. Like they've kind of identified 9th and 10th graders that they already have a verbal commitment with, and it's a matter of kind of seeing that through. Now, of course, there's always going to be shifts in those commitments because they are just verbal, and students get injured or what have you, and coaches change and things of that nature. But for the most part, I think that you're right in terms of June 15th being the time when you can expect the greatest amount of activity.
Gotcha. So let's talk about these different forms of communications. Now, my understanding is that students are able to reach out and contact coaches for questions anytime that they would like to be able to do so. But you're saying that D1 coaches have restrictions on how they can contact the student athletes directly. and that there are restrictions on visits. Let's just make sure that we understand the concept of the official visit or the unofficial visit and how that fits into the whole recruitment process.
That's complicated.
Okay. We've only got a few minutes here, Kenan. So
yeah, I know.
Yeah.
So with the official visits, well, let's set those aside for the moment. Unofficial visits are basically the family is paying for the visit. They're meeting the coach during that visit, but there's no expenditure on the coach's part.
Okay. So I'm in town and I'm visiting campus and I stop by the coach's office and I say, hi, my name's Ian Fisher. I got a 60-mile-an-hour fastball, and that's it. Okay, great.
Right. Yeah. But they're not flying you in and doing all of that. So, and for the most part, Division I does allow for unofficial visits only after August 1st, between the sophomore and junior year. So even at Division I, even the unofficial limits have a specific, or unofficial visits have a specific timeline.
Okay.
The official visits for Division I, they actually changed the rules. So now the students can do an official visit in their junior year. However, they're still limited to only 5 official visits at the D1 level.
Okay.
So you need to be careful about where you're choosing to go for those official visits and the programs that and campuses that you want to go see.
Gotcha. So if I'm a likely recruit for a D1 school, I might have lots of invitations to do an official visit, but I should be choosy about which ones I take them up on.
Exactly.
Because is that just because of funding, or like if I wanted to go see the other schools, I would have to then do an unofficial visit and that would cost me money out of pocket to go and visit that campus, but I could still do an unofficial visit for another school, right?
You can still do an unofficial visit. That's correct.
Okay.
But in terms of paid official visits, Division I athletes are limited to 5.
Gotcha. Okay. Now let's, so we've got the visits, the unofficial visits, the official visits. D3 doesn't seem to have a whole lot of that rolled into their process. And it seems like the majority of student athletes are in the D3 category, like nationwide, or is that
Absolutely.
right? Okay.
Yep,
Gotcha. So let's talk a little bit about how this starts to intersect with the actual admission and application process. Mm-hmm. What is the point at which you've got some sense of clarity about which schools are recruiting you? And then how does that start to fit in with the college application process? Maybe you can answer that first part first. So like, when does this start to look really clear where you're saying, all right, here are some schools where the coaches are interested in me as a player?
Right. That can take place anywhere in that timeline, depending upon whether or not the match has been made between student athlete and the school. Mm-hmm. So I actually just got off the phone last hour with a student who is a golf recruit, and the coaches, she's in her junior year, spring of her junior year, and the coaches are telling her to send in her applications now.
Wow.
So so it can take place rather early. Most of the athletes that I've worked with, by the time they hit mid-September, the process is pretty much over. They've either sent in an early decision application for the D3 programs or Division I programs like the Ivies, et cetera, or they've made a commitment where they're saying they're only going to play for that one school, in the case of like a Wesleyan, for instance, and the application has already been sent in by somewhere from August to early September. So the advice that I have for parents of athletes is to be prepared for that type of early timeline, which means you're writing essays earlier. You're telling your teachers that they may need to have those recommendation letters done by August 1st in some cases, so that that's ready to go and ready to be submitted. So it does kind of shift everything forward a bit. And to avoid that big scramble in August, you want to make sure that everyone that needs to react to that, that's going to be your guidance counselors and your teachers primarily, knows that that is a possibility.
We always talk about the importance of taking care of the people who are advocates for you in the application process, your letters of recommendation writers, counselors, teachers. Communicate with them, be open, be transparent, help them help you, right? Like right. It's huge. It reflects well on you in your letters of recommendation, and you just want to take care of those people. Now, the admission process, especially a lot of students will think about athletic recruitment as an opportunity to get into a school where that might be a reach for them academically, but they've got this athletic profile that is desirable for that school. Now, ultimately, the final decision comes down to the admission office. They decide who gets into that school. The coaches would love to, but while they have some input at varying levels, depending on the sport, depending on the division, they don't have the final say. The admission office does. How do students engage with that sort of reality as they look at their whole recruitment process?
I think primarily what you're going to see is that the coaches will ask for transcripts early on, and if the student has scores fairly early on, to be able to take those transcripts and the material that they're asking for to the admissions office and get a green light for recruitment. Okay. So that often happens in the spring of the junior year and the summer of after the junior year. And once they get that green light, then primarily it's going to be getting the application material in early, like I was saying before, so that they can get those decisions made early in the process. So oftentimes, like I had a student who was on her way to Brown, and she had her decision October 1st as an early decision applicant. Wow. So different schools are going to, within that short spectrum, that short window, be able to make some of those decisions. Now, with Division I athletes, there's the admissions process, but then there's also the scholarship process, and they would often sign their national letter of intent sometime in early November. There's different windows there, but that's when you're making that official commitment. And in order to go to another school, you would have to be released from that national letter of intent by your coach to be able to pursue another option.
Gotcha. And I think at that point, you've got some pretty clear sense of how the different restrictions work. You're a veteran of the recruitment process by that point and have figured a lot of that stuff out once you get there. Right. So it always seems like, I mean, when we talk about this internally among our team and we've got questions around athletic recruitment, some of our experts in this space, like you, will say early. Like this is just a case where you're really shifting the entirety of the college application process forward by 4 to 6 months. And so it's just a matter of being open and communicative and being on top of things if you are a student athlete. And I think it sounds like it really places a more of a priority even on how you do in 11th grade academically, if you're looking at those schools that want to give you that review, because that's going to be a way of sewing up that admission offer at a place where you want to play a particular sport and the coach already has your back. Get the admissions office on your side as well.
Exactly.
Do you have any final tips that you would want to give in the last few seconds we've got here?
Yeah, the only other thing that I would mention that we haven't talked about especially for D1 students is just paying attention to the NCAA Eligibility Center and making sure that you fill out your profile, which basically asks whether or not you're an amateur athlete. And then make sure that you coordinate with whoever it is in the counseling office that the final transcripts with those 14 core courses will be sent to the eligibility center with your profile number so that you can get a final academic eligibility. And that's because that's another step for the D1 students.
So the NCAA is governing the competition at that level. And so they have their own set of rules and restrictions outside of the context of what a particular college might prefer that you have.
Correct.
Okay, perfect. Correct. Kenan, I think that makes sense. So if you are a student who's interested in recruitment, make sure you practice, make sure you shift things early, stay on top of your grades, stay on top of your sport, and I guess eat well and get a lot of sleep, right? I mean, yeah, cool. Thanks a lot, Kenan. This is always great. I always learn something when we're talking about athletics. It's just such a complicated process, and hopefully this helps people understand it a little bit better.
Terrific. Glad to help.
Awesome. When we come back, we're going to talk about getting organized through the admission and financial aid process. Last segment of the show. You won't want to miss it. We'll see you after the break.